So I thought I would do a video for you guys on Russia. Um, on the internet, there is a lot of reverence for Russia on the part of the conservatives and the right wing, and even you're actually starting to see some of this on mainstream television, especially with people like Tucker Carlson. So I thought I would do a video on this, not just to correct this mentality, but at the same time to correct myself. Because for years I have done articles and videos and posts in support of Russia. And so really consider this video as a form of introspection on my part. Because I have corrected myself on this issue, and I'm still learning. Bottom line, I'm still learning. Every year, I'm reading new books, learning new things. And so as I learn new things, I educate myself, I correct myself, and hopefully I get a chance to inform you guys. So, going back to Russia, a lot of conservatives have this love for Russia. For the right reasons, actually, for the most part, for good reasons. For one, the Russian government has this appearance of being a defender of Christian values. And this was the big thing for me. I thought that Russia was the great defender of Christianity because of Russia's laws against the LGBT, against Sodom. And I don't disagree with this form of legislation. But one thing that I would say is that I think it can be used as a cover-up for something else. In other words, I think it's really more of a form of giving an appearance of Christianity as opposed to having a legitimate desire to defend Christianity. Now, that's not to say that there aren't people in Russia who want to defend Christianity. There are many people in Russia who want to do this, and God bless them. But I'm talking about the higher echelons of power within the Russian government, the Russian deep state. And so years ago, there was this, and this is one of the stories that really got me interested in Russia. Years ago, there was a group of Orthodox believers, supposedly Orthodox believers, who crashed a degenerate art show. There was this art show, I think it was in Moscow, basically portraying horrendous, blasphemous images of Jesus Christ. Really, really bad stuff. And three young people, a woman, and two men, they went into this art gallery and they crashed it. They were putting stuff on the floor, or they were, throwing stuff on the floor, and they crashed it, and it made big news in Russia. Now, the leader of this group is a guy by the name of Dmitry Anteo, and I think his real last name is Soronov, but everyone knows him as Dmitry Anteo. And Dmitry Anteo was the leader of this group. I think it was called God First or something like that. Or God's Will. It was called God's Will. I don't know the Russian term, but in English it translated to God's Will. And what I found strange about this event was that only one person really got punished or really got pressure from the government after this event. It was the young woman who was involved. Her name was Mila Odekhova. And I ended up interviewing Mila and keeping contact with her. And I always found it strange that she was the only one who got threatened with a fine. In fact, she was the only one who got put into court, and she's still going through a legal battle, if I'm not mistaken. But Anteo didn't get touched. And then, a number of years later, Anteo makes friends, becomes the boyfriend for one of the members of the female punk rock band Pussy Riot. Now, it's very interesting that Pussy Riot was a band that they rushed into the very famous cathedral in St. Petersburg. I think it's the Church of the Virgin Mary, I believe. They went into this church and they just started jumping up and down and mocking Christ, making fun of Putin, mocking the Virgin Mary. And then they ended up getting a jail sentence. And then not too long later, Putin relieves them and says, okay, they're not going to jail anymore. And so now there was this whole battle between the left and the right being Orthodox Christians, and the left being sort of represented by this Pussy Riot image. So it was this tension between left and right in Russia. But then it turns out that one of the big right-wingers in Russia, Dmitry Anteo, is dating one of the members of Pussy Riot, and Anteo says, oh, they're not so bad, yada, yada, yada. And then this member of Pussy Riot says, oh, Mr. Anteo isn't so bad, he actually loves gay people. And all these sorts of events made me rethink a lot of things, like, okay, are they really enemies? I'm sure many of them are legitimate enemies. But the question is, are there bad faith actors involved in this sort of conflict that are only riling people up, putting fuel on the fire, and really amplifying a strategy of tension in Russia? Like Reds versus Whites, Bolsheviks versus Nationalists, things like that. That sort of strategy of tension. So it makes one wonder about the whole thing. And there was another thing that got me thinking about Russia. Alexander Dugin, and he's this big intellectual, supposedly has a lot of ties with the Kremlin. And Dugin is huge on supporting nationalism in Europe. Not just any nationalism, but very dangerous, fascistic, racist nationalism. He supports the identitarians in Western Europe. This is why a number of years ago, I want to say back in 2015 or 16, maybe even 2014, there was this Eurasian conference that Dugin had organized, and one of the speakers at this event was Martin Sellner. One of the people that were invited into this event was Martin Sellner, the leader of the Austrian Identitarian Party, and he was interviewed at this conference. And in this conference, Martin Sellner talked about a syncretism between Christianity and paganism as a way to create unity between all the different nationalist entities in Western Europe. Uniting pagans and Christians together in order to fight against mass immigration. So again, why would this Russian nationalist be supporting Germanic nationalism when historically the Germans and the Russians have been enemies for the most part, World War I, World War II, even though they did have Germany and Russia has shared alliances and they have agreed on certain things in the past. For example, back in the late 1800s, Russia and Prussia both agreed on controlling a Polish inhabited region, and I think it was called Posen, the Posen region, and they were completely okay with controlling and persecuting the Poles. There was another event that happened I want to say, it wasn't in the era of Bismarck, but it was, I think, before that. Again, 19th century. The Poles of Posen wanted to have a revolt against Tsarist control of their region, and the Prussians backed that revolt, knowing that, for one, knowing that the Poles could overthrow the Russians with German help, and then knowing very well that as soon after the Poles would get their liberation, the Prussians would then take it over and control it themselves. So, and again, Prussians and Russians have come to an agreement on controlling the Poles. This is what happened during the Second World War. Germany controlled Western Poland, the Soviet Union controlled Eastern Poland, and they both tried to exterminate the Poles together. So, again, the Polish people, they till this day, they are so paranoid about the Russians. And Polish people have said, don't trust the Russians, don't trust the Russians. They massacred our people by the tens of millions. And these Polish people are right. Because, all these years I've been talking about Japan and Germany, the dangers of Japanese nationalism and the dangers of German nationalism, and I'm going to continue making these points because it's absolutely true. The Germans committed horrendous genocide during the Second World War. The Japanese Imperial Empire committed horrendous genocide in East Asia, Southeast Asia as well. So we have to talk about these things, not because, just for the sake of talking about it, but for the fact that these countries are still heading towards those directions. They still want to have a return to imperialism and nationalism and militarism, and this is what makes it so dangerous, and this is what makes it so pertinent to look back into this history. Now you go to Russia and you find out that the Russians still have an interest in taking control of territories that they once controlled in the time of the Soviet Union and also in the time of the Tsardom. And so you look back at recent history, Russia killed more people than Nazi Germany, more people than Imperial Japan. And you're like, wait a second, we have to talk about this issue. This is super important because if the Russians still have this aspiration, if Putin and the Kremlin, if they still have this aspiration to revive their empire, then you're going to have war and bloodshed and genocide, and a lot of people are going to suffer. So it's so important to have focus on this. And the fact also that if you look at the Catalonian situation, Catalonia, now you're saying, Ted, you were talking about Japan and Germany and Russia, now you're talking about Catalonia. We have to talk about Catalonia. Remember what happened in Catalonia back in 2017? There was an illegal referendum that took place to vote for whether or not the Catalans would secede from the power of Madrid. This was extremely dangerous for obvious reasons. If you start splitting Europe up, then you intensify the prospect for war in Western Europe. And I think that this is really the whole goal behind supporting this sort of separatism. Or separatism, completely. Separatism is very dangerous, especially in a volatile situation like now where you have, people being so conditioned to the idea of the EU. If you break apart the EU, then you're going to go right back to the old rivalries, and you will see a restoration of militarist ideology becoming more and more fashionable. So the Catalan situation, the Catalonians had a vote. The majority of the people who voted, I want to say over, 90% of the people who voted in favor for separatism. Now, the loyalists in Catalonia are saying, hey, most people didn't vote. Well, doesn't really matter at this point because you didn't go and voted, and when you don't vote, it becomes your problem. Whatever consequences of you not voting is, becomes your problem. And now you have a bunch of people in Catalonia who believe very, very intensely that they have a claim to independence. And this sets a very, very dangerous precedence, and it makes for a very dangerous situation. Now, what I did not look into until recently is Russia's involvement in that whole situation. Russia had a lot of interest in that whole political phenomena, and in fact, there was an investigation that was done recently by the Spanish government on Russia's involvement in the Catalonian referendum or in Catalonian nationalism in general. And they believe that there is a possibility that there was a Russian intelligence agent by the name of Denis Sergeyev. And Denis Sergeyev was a member of is a member of Unit 29155, which is, I'm guessing, a unit of Russian intelligence. These guys are veterans of Russia's bloodiest wars, like Afghanistan, Chechnya, and Ukraine. So these guys are ruthless. And the Spanish government has not come to a conclusion on whether or not Sergeyev was involved in the referendum. We do know that he was in Madrid, or he was in Spain just a couple of days before the referendum took place. And it makes you wonder why he was there and what he was doing there. But we're not going to be able to come to a conclusion until the investigation has been concluded. But what we do know is that there was a direct interest that Russian media outlets had with Catalonian separatism and supporting Catalonian nationalism. One of the biggest examples of this was a Russian media website called Zgliad. And Zgliad, I can't pronounce this. Zgliad is a website that basically is a mouthpiece for the Kremlin. And they were pushing out all these articles in support of Catalonian separatism. In fact, they were saying some pretty extremist stuff. For example, like Catalonia is like Crimea. So the Russians have this narrative, and I don't know if it's true or not, but the Russians have this narrative that the majority of people in Crimea wanted to be under Russian control, and that's why Russia invaded Crimea without a bullet being fired. Now, this may be true, but that's not the point. The point is that the Russians were comparing Crimea to Catalonia, in that the Catalonians don't want to be under the control of Madrid, just like the Crimeans didn't want to be under the control of Kiev. And so Russia rescued Crimea. And this is implying that, well, Catalonia needs rescuing. And there was one article that came from Zgliad that said something like, the cause of Crimea has now expanded into the Pyrenees or to Western Europe. So it's seeing the Russian cause as being expanded into Western Europe. And there was a number of other examples like this. It wasn't just Zgliad. There was also Pravda and RT and Espanol. They were pushing this sort of pro-Catalonian narrative. And it's amazing that in this whole situation, you have Russia pushing for the breaking up of the EU. So, of course, the Catalonian situation, being very volatile, is a perfect type of scenario to capitalize on. There's a number of other examples. So, for one, the leader of the leading representative of Catalonian separatism is Carles Puigdemont. Carles Puigdemont was exiled because he was wanted by the Spanish government, and still is. And he fled all the way to Brussels, where he was being hid. He was being protected by the New Flemish Alliance, which is a Flemish separatist and nationalistic party with a lot of sympathies to Nazism. And it's very interesting how you have Catalonian separatists who are very left-wing being backed by a right-wing party in Brussels. The left-wing harmony right there. And Carles Puigdemont was wanted for promoting separatism, for promoting revolution, which is a serious offense. And if he is found guilty for this, he could end up having a 15, 20-something year sentence for, it's a pretty long time to be in prison. And he left Brussels and he made his way all the way up to the Faroe Islands, if I'm not mistaken, where he made a speech on separatism and supporting Catalonia and all that. Then he returned back and he went to Denmark, and in Denmark he got arrested and he ended up being in German custody. The German government then said, Spain, you cannot put this man in trial for mutiny or for promoting separatism. And that means that Puigdemont is getting a big protection from the German government. Now, why would the German government be protecting this guy? Why would the Russians be promoting his cause? It's very interesting. It's almost as though both the Germans and the Russians want to see Europe get broken apart. Why is that? Well, if Europe gets broken apart, if it gets fragmented, Germany will begin to push for militarism and will begin to revitalize its military power. How do I know this? That's exactly what was happening after Brexit. That is exactly what was taking place, and that is what is happening. And to this day, the Germans keep referencing Brexit when they talk about reviving Germany's military power, or when they talk about, having a Weltpolitik, a world policy, or putting Germany back in the map of foreign policy and all that. So that is what makes this situation so dangerous. And what further confirms my assumption that this is what is happening, because the Russians also want to see the breakup of Europe. Why do they want to see that? Well, it could be that they can see it as an opportunity to invade Europe, or it could be something else. It could be that the Russians want to see a revived Germany, because then together they can control Poland. Poland has grown to be an economic power, a world economic power. It used to be a very impoverished country. It used to be a very, very poor country. Now its economy is very substantial. The Russians and the Germans don't want to see that. Just like the Prussian government in the late 19th century and the Tsar both agreed on controlling Posen and controlling the Poles. Just like the Soviet Union and the Third Reich both agreed on controlling Poland. So I think the Russians, they want to see a revival of German nationalism. That's the reason why you have Russians supporting German identitarianism and German nationalist parties like the AfD. Where do the Americans fit in all of this? Well, we can't be entirely sure because we don't have all the documents. But what we do know is that there is a party called, in Spain, in fact, there's a party called Vox, and it's a big nationalist Spanish party. What's very interesting about Vox is that at one point in time, they were a nothing party. They were very obscure. Now they have 52 seats in the Spanish parliament, of a parliament that consists of 350 seats. That's very, very substantial. 350 seats, you have 52 of those seats? That's very big. Vox got almost €1 million from an Iranian, U.S.-backed Iranian lobbyist group. Their armed wing is the MEK, or the People's Mujahideen of Iran. And they gave almost €1 million to Vox. Now, it's interesting that the MEK is backed by the United States, thanks to people like Rudy Giuliani and Newt Gingrich and John Bolton. and now they're giving money to a Spanish nationalist party. Now, what interest would a bunch of Iranians have in a obscure Spanish nationalist party? Nothing, really. My opinion is that the Americans are paying Vox, they're funding Vox through a third party. I could be wrong, but this is what I suspect. Because it just doesn't make any sense that an Iranian lobbyist group would be giving money to Spanish nationalists. Now, in my opinion, it could be that the Americans want Vox to rise up as a form of perpetuating strategy of tension in Spain. You have the Spanish nationalists on one side and the Spanish left wing on the other side. The Spanish left wing is seen in a very strong form in the Catalonian separatism, and also in the recent development that took place in Spain, in which the Spanish government, ran by the Socialist Party, exhumed Francisco Franco's remains from the famous mausoleum where he was buried to a different graveyard like 30 miles away. Now, I don't agree with this at all. I think we should respect the dead, but at the same time, it makes you wonder why they did this. It really enraged the right wing. It really enraged people that would vote for Vox. It really enraged politicians in a party like Vox. And so I have so much information to give to you guys, but I don't want to I don't want to overload you guys, but you're seeing this whole situation. The United States, Russia, Germany, and then you have this Steinmeier situation in which the Germans are proposing this idea of allowing two regions of eastern Ukraine to be Donetsk and Lugansk, I think they're called, two regions of eastern Ukraine to become autonomous states. These autonomous states these two regions are inhabited mainly by ethnic Russians. What would that mean if these two states become independent or autonomous? They would become Russian satellites, essentially. Why would the Germans propose this plan? Why would the Germans push for this plan? It's only helping the Russians. I thought the Germans hated the Russians. Do they really? Or are they both? Do they both understand that they can work together to fulfill their own interest? And then, like the Soviet Union and the Third Reich, start killing each other again, because that's what most likely is going to occur in the future. So yeah, a lot of information there. I don't want to cram you guys up enough. I've already done that enough, right? I haven't done a video in a while, so I've been thinking about the subject, so I thought I would put that out there. I'm going to put an article on the bottom of this video. You guys can watch it or read it. And yeah, hope you guys enjoyed this message. Hope you guys have learned something from this message. You guys just heard some theology. God bless.